but growing position is that it is entirely a later Christian interpolation.
So Dan is completely incorrect here. The growing position is not that the Testimonium Flavianum is a forgery. So this is a little annoying because Dan is always talking about data over dogma, but here he doesn't actually know the data. It seems like he's very unfamiliar with his scholarship about Josephus and about Josephus in general. Now, we can see this in a variety of different ways, but in one of his recent podcasts, he talks about how Josephus was from Galilee. That's simply incorrect. This leads me to believe that he doesn't really know a lot about the subject, because when we look at Josephus, he was not from Galilee, he was from Jerusalem. He was a priest from a priestly family that was well respected. Now, Josephus does go to Galilee later on in his life, but that's because he is a general during the First Jewish War. He is not from Galilee in any manner. Now, since Dan seems unfamiliar with the actual scholarship here, I think that's why he makes us blunder. Because if you look at the facts, if you look at the data, we can see that there is no growing position that the entire thing is a forgery. If we look at the scholarship over the last 100 years, what we have seen is that more and more individuals, more and more scholars are taking this central position, that there might have been a couple lines added, but the core of it is authentic. So Alice really traces this through her book, but we can also look at Lewis Feldman, who in the 1980s did a survey of all the research from 1937 to 1980, and what he saw was that there was 13 scholars during that time period who said that the entire thing was a forgery. Now, if we actually look at those studies that said that it was a forgery and we compare this to what Alice really has to say, what we see is that most of those papers saying that it was a forgery occurred earlier on in that time frame. So they're closer to 1937 than they are to 1980. Now, this decline in that position can actually be seen over the next 20 years because we have an informal survey around the 2000s, I think it was by Patrick Kirby, that actually showed that there was maybe 3 Ford scholars at that time who took the position that the entire thing was a forgery. Now, I do have to make a brief correction here to my previous video because I said that all the scholars who believe that it's a forgery are mythicists. That's not quite true. There's a couple of people who are not mythicists who do think that it's a complete forgery. But again, we're looking at 3, 4, maybe 5 scholars total. So if we look at all the data here, what we see is that this position that it's a forgery has steadily decreased over the years, and there's really no sign that it's growing again. So really, Dan is simply wrong here. He needs to actually look at the research.